Hello folks, Russ Scala here with Scala Precision Health. I'm also the Director of Research and Development for Professional Treatment Centers and Addiction Center here in Winter Park, Florida. Today I wanted to take a deep dive in how stress impacts your metabolism on a very timely topic now. Emergency workers, police, fire, and EMS compromise their metabolism when they're in a high-stress environment, and this is an area that I've been studying since 1984 when I graduated the police academy and I was placed on the SWAT team. My job was to go into the hot zone if an officer was shot, insert 2 large-bore IV needles. I carried an MP5 submachine gun, I carried a Sig Sauer 9mm, and I wore a Kevlar Second Chance vest. My job was to get the officer that was shot to the trauma center within an hour. The golden hour at the time told us that if we got even a gunshot wound to the heart into the trauma center within an hour, their recovery would have been 80 to 90%. So what I wanted to glean from that is my career of 40 years in medicine, 20 years of responding to emergency calls, and basically what happens to the police officer's metabolism when he's on the emergency scene. Hollywood and the media sort of causes us to be a little bit naive when it really comes to what goes on an emergency scene. Folks, I was there, I witnessed it. Are there bad cops out there? Of course, but they're usually taken care of by the good cops. Responding to emergency calls, shootings, and high-stress occupations damages your body over time, and this is one of the areas my company focuses on today. We take care of very high-stress employees, we take care of high-stress patients, and we try to rebalance their body chemistry. But let me start with what goes on inside of a police officer's metabolism when he responds on the scene. And if you take a look at the chart I developed, I call it good cop, bad cop, just as a reference. When you're on the scene 5, 10, 15, 20 years, your amygdala or your fear center and your prefrontal cortex, your decision-making process, can be compromised over time. And I think nobody really understands that when a police officer is in the fight or flight mode, constantly responding to calls, his brain chemistry can change over time. Now, obviously, I'm not saying he's going to become a bad cop, but he's more susceptible to more traumatic, more violent situations because his feel-good chemicals, his neurotransmitters are low. Now, neurotransmitters, folks, are electrochemical messenger in our brain that allow us to feel good and get us ramped up for excitement, helps us jump out of the way of the car. Well, what happens is serotonin, cortisol, dopamine, and adrenaline become compromised over time in the police officer's brain. The reason I highlighted cortisol and adrenaline in red is because while you're in a constant fight or flight response, you will damage your neurological architecture over time. And this is an area that nobody's talking about, folks. This is a combination of interventional endocrinology, psychoneuroimmunology, cardiology, nutrition, that it would take 5 years for a police officer to get answers. I'm trying to compartmentalize this so this information can get out to the Police Chiefs Association. I could put this information in a police officer's hands. So if they start to get depressed, if they start to feel bad, if they have interrupted sleep patterns like I've had, usually you want to isolate yourself. You don't even want to be around citizens. So my point is, being on the job that long and being in a high-stress environment compromises your physiology. Again, our neurotransmitters, folks, serotonin, our feel-good neurotransmitter. Cortisol is elevated during stress. Dopamine is our other feel-good neurotransmitter. And adrenaline, part of our fight or flight response. Over time, these things become compromised. When you constantly respond to emergency calls and you're constantly in a dangerous environment, it compromises your brain chemistry over time, and there's really no help for that other than sleeping pills and antidepressants. We already know that the police officers have a high amount of heart attacks, obesity, depression. That's really common in the job. A lot of them retire as alcoholics. I work in an addiction center. As a research director, I see that every day. So this information that I want you to glean today, this is a hypothesis that I pulled together with my time in the street. I've had buddies that were police officers and paramedics commit suicide. In 1989, I was put on the critical incident stress debriefing team. So after a traumatic incident, we were able to talk and vent what we saw, what we were going through. But when you see this trauma, when you have a baby die in your arms, or you start an IV, or you see somebody that's shot in the head, there's brain matter all over the wall, you can't come home and discuss that with anybody. You don't want to go to a counselor, because if that ends up in your record, you're not going to get promoted. So this is the world we live in, and you wonder why these guys isolate themselves. Empathy plays a big role in this. Some PhDs say that we pick up psychopathic behavior. And psychopathic behavior, I picked that up while as a paramedic because I cared so much about my patients that over time I had to learn not to care. I had to have less empathy so I could focus on an IV. I could shut their screams out in my head and I could get them to the emergency room. And once I dropped them at the emergency room door, I didn't worry about it because I did my job. So when I talk about psychopathic behavior, Chris Kyle as the American Sniper, and then obviously on the far end here, serial killers. Chris Kyle was able to do his job as a sniper, I think with over 151 confirmed kills. He was able to come home, love his family, love his children, and that's on the empathy, on the empathy scale, he still maintained a lot of empathy. Obviously, we're a serial killer. If you study Ted Bundy or you see the reviews or some of his interviews, he just had no empathy. He lacked empathy completely. So one of the other areas that I want to talk about is if we test police and firemen and police, firemen, EMS people early, we could detect low neurotransmitter levels before they even go on the job. If you have a police officer that's been on the scene for 20 years, we can start testing his neurotransmitter levels, look at his intestinal tract, balance out his hormonal deficiencies, folks, because these tests are not offered in traditional medicine. Their metabolism is breaking down every few years, and none of these tests are offered in traditional medicine. This is what I want to do. I want to bring this information to light. It's all backed up with research and studies. The media and what's happening with the 800,000 certified police officers right now, they're getting a bad rap and nobody really knows what they go through on a daily basis. One of the best things that we did on the SWAT team is we put citizens and city administrators through a shoot, don't shoot situation. When you get their heart rate up and you have them in front of a screen with a weapon, they really start to understand what it's like to be involved in a critical shooting event. Other than that, everything we learn on TV or we see in the media, it's not real. One thing that happens to police officers when they're on a very traumatic scene is they have what they call flashbulb images. Usually when we want to remember a phone number, it goes to our hippocampus, and we have to say it like 4 or 5 times before we remember it. Then it goes into long-term storage, long-term potentiation, or we remember it. We can remember a phone number after we repeat it. If you're on a traumatic scene, there's a flashbulb image that imprints that image on your brain forever. We know this from war veterans. We know this from other police officers. So if we know that high-stress environments compromise the amygdala, our fear center, our prefrontal cortex is our decision-making center, where there's actually something called transient hypofrontality. When you're in the fight or flight response, I know that's a big word, but your decision-making center shuts down, okay? And you go back to your original training. One great example of this is when you were shooting at paper targets when police officers were still using the revolvers and they were shooting at paper targets, and they would stand still, they would have to empty their rounds back into their hand to get the brass, and they would hold onto the brass and put it into a bucket to reload the rounds later on. So the police officers would go to a range, train, shoot at the target. After 6 shots, they would empty the rounds in their hand, the brass, and they would hold it. Well, what happened was when these officers went into a real live shooting situation, when the investigators came in, they found out some of the officers had brass in their hand. So what I'm saying is when you're lit up like a firecracker and you're under a high-stress occupation or in a high-stress situation, your prefrontal cortex shuts down. And these officers that were involved in a real shooting went back to what they learned on the range. They were involved in a shooting and they dumped the brass in their hands, which is, you don't want that because those seconds could have saved their life. So my point is training is extremely important. And I want you to remember this, folks, everybody out there. We have sane men in insane situations, okay? And I don't want to leave out the women either. We have sane men in insane situations, and we don't take care of them. Look at our war veterans. We could glean a lot of information from our war vets, okay? When they go to boot camp, whether they go to BUDS or they become a Navy SEAL, they're never 5 feet from their buddy, ever. They go to Afghanistan, they're special forces, they're never 5 feet from their team member. These guys get injured, they come home alone. They come home without their tribe. Now, if you're in that intense environment, just like if you're a police officer like I was in that intense environment, how am I going to relate to normal citizens? How am I going to understand what the NFL is going to do the next day or whether somebody wants me to go to Beds Bath & Beyond. It doesn't compute. So this information that I'm sharing with you is real science, okay? We could pull it together. You could even Google a lot of how stress impacts the amygdala, our fear center, and our prefrontal cortex over time. We know by studying and using fMRIs, we could compromise our neurological architecture. This has happened to me with PTSD. It happened to my coworkers. I've had friends commit suicide that were on the job, and nothing was done for them. And I'm not saying we can't make any changes. I think if this information gets in the right people's hands, I think we could really affect change over the police departments. Maybe we could understand violence, why it happens, how it happens. I've been side by side with men and women police officers that were lifesavers. They saved lives. We went into homes and gave mouth-to-mouth to babies that had vomited in my mouth. I took people down off 300-pound people off a toilet down 4 flights of stairs with policemen and firemen to get them into the ambulance. You know, there's a lot. It's not all about emergencies. A lot of times when we responded into different communities, we were there to help them. We were there, and it's a very important part of what we're doing today. So next, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of physiology that may light you up a little bit. I'm going to walk you through what happens to your body, your hormonal levels, what happens to your heart when you spend 5, 10, 15 years, 30 years on the job. Folks, we're going to talk physiologically what goes on inside a police officer's metabolism after 5, 10, 15, 20, even 30 years on the job. Let me just explain. Traditional medicine, general practitioners and physicians are really not familiar with this because they don't test for it. They run regular lab work that really only spots pathology and disease in late stages. What I'm talking about doing is obviously from our first chart, test neurotransmitter levels, those feel-good chemicals in the brain, our adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, to help us detect depression early, help us, with obesity, because the heavier a police officer is, it causes thinning of the nerve cells in the brain. So if an officer is obese, male or female, it's going to compromise his metabolism even more. So we want to make sure these guys stay healthy and get them on a healthy weight loss program, along with protecting their heart because they have heart attacks in their 40s. So physiologically, what I'm going to show you right now is a combination of nutrition, interventional endocrinology, psychoneuroimmunology. We glean a lot of research from Dr. Sapolsky out of Stanford, the PhD that's famous for psychoneuroimmunology. He wrote the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers and the 700-page book Behave, where he really focuses on how stress compromises the system. Now, what I'm going to talk about right now, folks, is when you are under chronic stress, in red, that's physical, mental, or emotional stress. You're responding to calls all the time. You are in a constant state of flight or flight. You go home and maybe you have interrupted sleep patterns. Your wife or your girlfriend wants to go do something, but all you want to do is be left alone to balance out your brain chemistry. And one of the things you got to understand, folks, is we have these little Pac-Men in our head. Think about little Pac-Men just gobbling up excess adrenaline. The more stress that you're under, these little Pac-Men, or called monoamine oxidase, these little Pac-Men disappear. So the more emergency calls you run, the more stressful environments that you're under, it circulates in your brain for days. Now, how does anybody live like that? These are the things that I want to discuss. This is the research that I want to open source. So if you're under chronic stress on the job, I used to work 96-hour shifts in a place called the Knife and Gun Club because I wanted to pay my house off. Not really a good move. I'm paying for that today when I was in my 20s, trust me. So chronic stress, it shuts off testosterone, growth hormone. IGF-1 is called insulin-like growth factor. This insulin-like growth factor, when it's elevated, it helps with bone, skin, heart, and brain structure. So you compromise your whole metabolism when you're under chronic stress. You lower your thyroid. You lower testosterone levels, which you need to protect your heart. No wonder they have heart attacks so early. When you're under chronic stress and you elevate cortisol and you lower testosterone and growth hormone and thyroid, the lining of every artery, called the endothelial lining, doesn't release nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is responsible to keeping arteries dilated. That in and of itself, just knowing that, can save lives. This is the information that I want to put in police officers' hands. I want to put it in police chiefs' hands across the United States. And again, we're going to open source this on the Russ Scala YouTube channel. So we know that the intestinal tract is the second brain. If your intestinal tract is out of balance from antibiotics, high carbohydrate food, alcohol, any medication that you're taking, it's going to compromise your brain chemistry. And a lot of police officers are on medication, Tagamed, Santec, they have acid reflux. They have an imbalance in the 1,000 different flora in their gut. And nobody tests them for that. So if the gut is a second brain from the leading neurologists now, and these guys are under a stressful environment, those neurotransmitters I showed you earlier on the first chart, serotonin, dopamine, and adrenaline and cortisol, it all starts in the gut here. So ground zero for your health is your intestinal tract, which is the second brain, but no police officer gets that tested. So in order to get a war veteran to feel better when he comes home, in order to get a police officer to rehab himself so he could stay in a career for 25, 30 years and then retire healthy, we have to educate the cities and counties around the United States that this testing is available. We have research laboratories and pharmacies that we're in partnership with now, but at our location in Winter Park, Florida, we're doing this testing right now. This is why I want to open source it. So again, chronic stress shuts off everything like a clock. Acute stress would be like lifting weights. Acute stress can be something like lifting weights or running intervals, very positive, can enhance everything. So maintaining an exercise program is extremely important. This right here is called the mitochondria. Your muscles have mitochondria, and mitochondria creates energy out of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Mitochondria creates ATP. That's how we create energy out of our food. If you think about it, in your bicep muscle, you have one. So say you have one bicep muscle cell, maybe you'll have 200 mitochondria. In your heart cell that beats 80 to 100,000 times a day, you may have 3,000 mitochondria. So understand how nutrition and these hormones impact you on a cellular level is also critical to keep a shield up as you stay in the game so you can retire healthy. And another thing this does, folks, like I said, when you work these kind of jobs, you're not right. You end up isolating yourself or just hanging out with other police officers or other war veterans. The quality of life goes in the toilet. Your tribe is not that healthy. Luckily, I got away from this and I found a group of triathletes and I was training outside. I had to buy a bike. I had to get up for swim practice. I was in the sun all the time. I raced all over Florida. Me changing my community saved my life. I mean, I'll say that 1,000 times. Me changing my community saved my life. I got away from responding to emergency calls. I was able to go back to graduate school. I was able to focus on this type of functional medicine and actually travel to the research labs. If I would have stayed on the job on the SWAT team as a paramedic, I'd be dead today, let me tell you. So what we're going to look at next is a few other areas from the nutritional side that could help put a shield up for these men and women in the streets. Okay, folks, from the first chart we talked about neurotransmitters. Well, here they are again. I want to briefly go over the importance of the gut-brain connection. This is extremely important to avoid antidepressants, SNRIs, SRRIs. This is extremely important to understand addictions. The gut-brain connection is extremely important. For these police officers, we have to make sure we test their intestinal tract. We have to look at the flora and rebalance their intestinal tract. The bacteria is very beneficial on how the brain's going to function, okay? So stress, the gut, age, brain, is all compromised over years. Alcohol, high carbohydrate diets, lack of protein. Folks, a police officer is not what he eats, he is what he absorbs. This is why testing this intestinal tract is so important. If the police officer is not pulling 21 minerals, 13 vitamins, 8 amino acids, 2 essential fats out of food, he's gonna mine it from his own body tissue. And he's gonna go into a state of muscle wasting. And by the end of his career, he's gonna be really sick with a low immune system. It's called sarcopenia. So if we could avoid that, if we could have a basic understanding of our neurotransmitters, the gut-brain connection, how to help these police officers deal with the stress on a daily basis. Everything from moving them away from a busy hot zone to moving them to a more calm area throughout the city, understanding and testing their neurotransmitter levels so we could detect depression, help them with their obesity because if they're overweight, they're in a constant state of flight or flight. So this is my passion, folks. I spent 20 years on the street. As I said, I was a police officer attached to the SWAT team, and it really affected me. And I'm still curious and passionate about getting this information out there to you. So you could take a deeper dive on the Russ Scala YouTube channel. You could see Scala Precision Health and my book, American Biohacker. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I planted some seeds, and please share this, because the 800,000 certified police officers, we need to help them and protect them. Thank you very much.
The time is now for you to take control of your health. Everybody and every body has a story. Let us find out yours today.